In the opulent yet suffocating halls of the Alcazar of Madrid, a king sat upon a throne that seemed to mock his very existence. Charles II of Spain, known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was a monarch whose body was a prison of deformity, whose mind flickered like a dying candle, and whose reign became a whispered tale of supernatural dread. His jaw protruded so grotesquely that he could scarcely chew. His tongue lolled in a mouth that struggled to form words, and his frail frame bore the weight of a dynasty so intermarried that it seemed the very blood in his veins had turned against him. In the late 17th century, as Spain clung to the remnants of its golden age, courtiers and commoners alike gazed upon their king with a mix of pity and terror, murmuring that no natural affliction could twist a man so surely. He was under a dark enchantment, a curse woven by unseen hands. This is the story of a ruler whose life was a tragedy penned by history itself, a man whose deformities shaped not just his fate, but the destiny of an empire teetering on the edge of collapse. To understand the enigma of Charles II, we must step back into the labyrinth of the Habsburg dynasty, a family that ruled over vast swathes of Europe with an iron grip and a dangerous obsession with purity of blood. By the time Charles was born on the 6th of November, 1661, the Habsburgs of Spain had spent generations marrying within their own ranks, weaving a tangled web of cousins, uncles, and nieces, in a desperate bid to preserve their divine right to rule. Charles's own parents, King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, a union that exemplified the dynasty's fatal flaw. This relentless inbreeding concentrated not just power, but also genetic frailties, passing down ailments and deformities like cursed heirlooms. The Habsburg jaw, a protruding mandible that became a grotesque signature of the family, was but one visible mark of a deeper Rota lineage so intertwined that it seemed destined to crumble under the weight of its own ambition. Charles's birth was met with both hope and trepidation. Spain, once the mightiest empire in the world, had seen its fortunes wane under Philip IV's reign, battered by endless wars, economic decline, and the loss of territories. The 30 Years' War had drained the treasury, the Dutch had slipped from Spanish control, and the once invincible Armada was a distant memory. A new king, even one born of such a troubled lineage, represented a chance for renewal, so the court prayed. But from the moment Charles emerged into the world, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. He was frail, sickly, and bore the unmistakable signs of his ancestry, a jaw so malformed that it hindered speech and eating, a body that seemed too weak to support even the lightest of crowns. As he grew, or rather failed to grow in the ways expected of a child, whispers began to spread. Wet nurses and physicians noted his delayed milestone. She did not walk until he was nearly 4, did not speak coherently for years after that, and the court began to wonder if this was merely the result of poor breeding or something far more sinister. The Spain of Charles's early years was a land steeped in superstition, where the line between the divine and the demonic was perilously thin. The Catholic Church held immense sway, and the Inquisition still hunted for heretics and witches in the shadows of every village. Illness and deformity were often seen not as medical conditions, but as signs of spiritual affliction, punishments from God, or, worse, the work of the devil. When Charles's condition failed to improve, when his body remained weak and his mind seemed clouded, the murmurs of bewitchment grew louder. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of a curse placed upon the Habsburg line, perhaps by a scorned rival or a vengeful sorcerer. Some pointed to the sins of the dynasty itself. Had their pride and incestuous unions invited divine retribution? Others claimed that Charles's mother, Mariana, had been targeted by dark forces during her pregnancy, her child marked before he even drew breath. These rumors were not mere gossip. They shaped how Charles was perceived, how he was treated, and how he came to see himself. As regent during Charles's minority, Mariana of Austria wielded power in a court rife with intrigue and factionalism. She was a woman caught between her duty to her son and the political machinations of those who sought to exploit the young king's frailty. Nobles vied for influence, knowing that a weak monarch meant opportunity for their own gain. Meanwhile, the common people, burdened by taxes and famine, looked to their king for salvation, only to find a figure who seemed more specter than sovereign. Charles's physical state became a public spectacle. his every stumble or slurred word a topic of discussion from Madrid to the farthest colonies. Physicians, priests, and even exorcists were called to examine him, their diagnoses ranging from inherited disease to demonic possession. Treatments were as varied as they were futile bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and prayers to banish evil spirits, all while the boy king endured in silence, a pawn in a game far larger than himself. Beyond the palace walls, the world was shifting in ways that would further imperil Spain's future. The rise of France under Louis XIV, the Sun King, cast a long shadow over Europe, and Spain's once dominant position was under constant threat. The colonies in the Americas, though still vast, were plagued by mismanagement and rebellion, while rival powers like England and the Netherlands chipped away at Spanish trade routes. Charles, though too young to grasp the full scope of these challenges, was already a symbol of a declining empire king whose broken body mirrored the fractured state he was destined to inherit. The question that haunted every mind, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful duke, was whether this child, so visibly marked by affliction, could ever rise to lead a nation in desperate need of strength. Thus, the stage was set for a reign unlike any other in Spanish history. Charles II, a boy born into a gilded cage of deformity and suspicion, would grow into a man whose very existence seemed to defy nature. His life would be a battle not just against his own body, but against the weight of a dynasty's sins and a kingdom's fading glory. As we delve deeper into his story, we will uncover how these early years of frailty and fear shaped a ruler who, despite everything, clung to his crown with a tenacity that defied all expectation. The whispers of bewitchment would only grow louder, the shadows darker, as Spain watched its king struggle to prove that he was more than a cursed relic of a dying age. As Charles II of Spain grew from a frail child into a young man, the weight of his crown became ever more crushing, not just metaphorically but physically. His body, already a canvas of deformity with its protruding Habsburg jaw and skeletal frame, seemed to rebel against the very idea of kingship. By the time he reached adolescence in the 1670s, it was clear that the boy king, who had only begun walking at 4 and speaking at 6, would never embody the robust, commanding presence Spain so desperately needed. His health remained precarious, plagued by fevers, seizures, and a digestive system so weak that he often vomited his meals. Yet, it was not just his physical ailments that deepened the shadows around him. It was the growing conviction among his subjects and even his closest advisors that his condition was no mere accident of nature. The whispers of bewitchment, once confined to hushed corners of the Alcazar, now echoed through the streets of Madrid, fanned by a court rife with intrigue and a populace hungry for explanations for their nation's decline. Charles officially assumed the throne at the age of 14 in 1675, though his mother, Mariana of Austria, had relinquished her regency with reluctance, knowing full well that her son was ill-prepared to rule. The court was a viper's nest of ambition, split between factions loyal to Mariana and those rallying behind Don Juan José of Austria, Charles's illegitimate half-brother, who saw the young king's weakness as a chance to seize power. Don Juan, a charismatic and capable military leader, was everything Charles was not: healthy, decisive, and unburdened by the grotesque physical markers of Habsburg inbreeding. His presence at court was a constant reminder of Charles's inadequacies and the tension between the two brothers, one legitimate but broken, the other a bastard but strong, simmered beneath every council meeting and royal decree. Nobles whispered that Don Juan should be the true ruler, while others, loyal to tradition, insisted that Charles, as God's anointed, must remain king, cursed or not. This division sowed chaos in a kingdom already buckling under economic hardship and military defeats, with Spain losing ground to France in the Franco-Dutch War and struggling to maintain control over its vast but crumbling empire. Beyond the political machinations, Charles's personal life became a battleground of its own. His deformities and ailments were not just a source of pity but of profound isolation. He could barely eat without pain, his malformed jaw making every meal a struggle, and his speech, slurred and halting, made communication a laborious task. Courtiers often misunderstood his intentions, or worse, mocked him behind his back, their cruel jests about the bewitched king reaching even his own ears. Yet Charles, despite his physical and mental limitations, was not entirely unaware of his plight. Historical accounts suggest he possessed a quiet, melancholic awareness of his condition, often retreating into prayer or solitude, seeking solace in a faith that promised answers where medicine and politics failed. His devotion to Catholicism, a cornerstone of Spanish identity, only deepened the public's fascination with his supposed curse. Priests and confessors hovered around him, some genuinely concerned for his soul, others eager to exploit his vulnerability to gain influence. The notion of bewitchment gained terrifying momentum during these years, fueled by a series of bizarre and tragic events. In 1677, a severe illness struck Charles, leaving him bedridden for weeks, his body racked by convulsions that seemed to defy medical explanation. Physicians, trained in the outdated humoral theories of the time, bled him relentlessly, their treatments likely worsening his condition. When he miraculously recovered, many at court attributed it not to resilience, but to divine intervention, or, more darkly, to the temporary lifting of a spell. Exorcists were summoned, their rituals involving holy water, incantations, and even the burning of supposed cursed objects found in the palace. One chilling account from the period describes a priest claiming to have discovered a wax figurine pierced with needles hidden in Charles's chambers, a supposed tool of witchcraft meant to torment the king. Whether this was genuine evidence or a fabrication by someone seeking to stoke fear remains unclear, but the effect was undeniable. Panic spread, and the idea that Charles was a victim of dark magic became an unshakable belief for many. This obsession with the supernatural was not merely a distraction. It actively undermined Charles's authority. Foreign ambassadors, particularly from France and the Holy Roman Empire, noted in their dispatches that the Spanish court was paralyzed by superstition, unable to focus on pressing matters of state while priests and charlatans held sway over the king's health. Louis XIV of France, ever the opportunist, watched with keen interest as Spain floundered under a monarch who seemed more ghost than man. The Sun King's spies reported on Charles's frailty, speculating that the Spanish Habsburg line might soon die out, opening the door for French claims to the throne. Meanwhile, the Spanish people, burdened by famine and plague, began to see their king's deformities as a mirror of their own suffering, a sign that God had turned his back on the nation, or that the devil himself had taken root in the heart of the empire. Amidst this rising conflict, Charles's personal torment deepened with the pressure to secure an heir. His first marriage, to Marie-Louise of Orléans in 1679, was arranged with the hope that a union with a healthy foreign princess might produce a child to continue the Habsburg line. Marie-Louise, a vibrant young woman from the French court, arrived in Spain with optimism, only to be met with the grim reality of her husband's condition. Charles, though kind and gentle by all accounts, was physically incapable of the intimacy required to conceive, his body too weak and his health too unstable. The court watched with bated breath, every month without news of a pregnancy fueling further speculation of a curse. Some blamed Marie-Louise, accusing her of barrenness or even complicity in the supposed witchcraft. Others pointed to Charles, insisting that no natural union could overcome the dark forces at play. The failure to produce an heir was not just a personal tragedy but a political catastrophe, as it left Spain's future hanging by a thread, vulnerable to the ambitions of foreign powers. Thus, the stage was set for an even darker chapter in Charles's reign. The rising conflict between factions at court, between superstition and reason, between Spain and its rivals tightened like a noose around the beleaguered king. His deformities, once a source of pity, became a weapon wielded by those who sought to control or discredit him, while his supposed bewitchment cast a shadow over every decision, every failure. As we move forward in this tale, we will see how these tensions pushed Charles into a decline that was as much spiritual as it was physical, a descent into a world where the line between reality and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. By the 1680s, Charles II of Spain, the so-called El Hechizado, had become a shadow of what a king was meant to be, trapped not just by the expectations of his crown but by the very body that housed his tormented soul. His physical deformities, the grotesquely protruding jaw, the frail limbs that seemed to buckle under their own weight, the constant ailments that left him bedridden for weeks, were no longer mere personal afflictions. They had become a public symbol of a dynasty in decay. Now in his 20s, Charles was a man whose every breath seemed a defiance of nature, Yet his spirit was increasingly imprisoned by the relentless decline of his health and the suffocating fear of bewitchment that gripped his court and kingdom. Spain, once the colossus of Europe, mirrored its monarch's frailty, crumbling under internal strife and external threats, while Charles himself became a prisoner to superstition, manipulation, and the unrelenting pain of his existence. The king's physical decline during this period was nothing short of harrowing. Historical records paint a grim picture of a man whose body seemed to betray him at every turn. His digestive issues worsened, rendering him unable to keep down even the simplest of meals, and his teeth, misaligned due to his malformed jaw, made chewing an agonizing ordeal. Seizures struck with alarming frequency, leaving him unconscious for hours, his courtiers hovering in a mix of dread and fascination, unsure if each episode would be his last. His immune system, compromised by generations of inbreeding, left him vulnerable to infections that lingered far longer than they should have, each illness etching deeper lines of exhaustion into his already gaunt face. Physicians, bound by the limited medical knowledge of the era, resorted to barbaric treatments, bloodletting, purging, and concoctions of mercury and other toxins that likely hastened his deterioration rather than alleviated it. Yet, through it all, Charles endured, his survival a testament to a quiet, stubborn will that refused to surrender, even as his body crumbled. This physical imprisonment was compounded by a psychological and spiritual cage forged by the pervasive belief in his bewitchment. The notion that Charles was under a curse had evolved from court gossip into a near-official doctrine, endorsed by influential clergy and exploited by opportunistic nobles. Exorcisms became a regular occurrence in the Alcazar of Madrid, with priests chanting over the king's trembling form, sprinkling holy water, and burning incense to drive out supposed demons. One particularly disturbing episode in 1684 saw a group of friars perform a ritual involving the sacrifice of a black rooster, its blood smeared on Charles's forehead as a ward against evil. Such acts, far from comforting the king, seemed to deepen his terror. Contemporary accounts suggest he wept during these ceremonies, murmuring prayers for deliverance, his faith warring with a growing fear that he was indeed marked by darkness. The line between protector and tormentor blurred as those meant to save him became agents of his suffering, their rituals a public spectacle that stripped him of dignity. The court itself became another kind of prison, a gilded cage where Charles was both revered as God's anointed and manipulated as a pawn. After the death of his half-brother Don Juan José in 1679, power struggles intensified, with factions led by nobles like the Duke of Medinaceli and later the Count of Oropesa vying for control over the king's decisions. Charles, whose mental capacity was limited likely due to the same genetic issues that ravaged his body, struggled to assert any real authority. He relied heavily on advisors, but their loyalties were often to their own ambitions rather than to him. His mother, Mariana of Austria, though no longer regent, cast a long shadow, her influence lingering through her allies at court. Meanwhile, Charles's first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, who had hoped to bring vitality to the marriage, grew despondent as the years passed without a child. Her frustration turned to melancholy, and her death in 1689 at the age of 26, possibly from appendicitis or poisoning, as rumors suggested, left Charles even more isolated, a widower whose inability to produce an heir was seen as further proof of a supernatural blight. Beyond the palace walls, the Spanish people watched their king's decline with a mix of pity and resentment. Famine ravaged the countryside, exacerbated by poor harvests and mismanagement, while the treasury bled dry from endless wars and colonial losses. The common folk, steeped in the same superstition as the court, saw Charles's deformities and childlessness as omens of divine displeasure, a sign that Spain itself was cursed. Pilgrims flocked to shrines, praying for the king's deliverance, while others muttered that only the death of the bewitched monarch could lift the shadow over the land. This public sentiment, though born of desperation rather than malice, weighed heavily on Charles, who, despite his limitations, was said to feel a deep sense of responsibility for his subjects. Letters from the period describe him weeping over reports of suffering in his kingdom, his hands trembling as he signed decrees he barely understood, a ruler imprisoned by his own powerlessness. Foreign powers, sensing Spain's vulnerability, tightened the noose around the empire, further isolating Charles on the world stage. Louis XIV of France, ever ambitious, pressed territorial claims in the Spanish Netherlands and elsewhere, knowing that Charles lacked the strength or allies to resist effectively. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, which ended the 9 Years' War, was a humiliation for Spain, ceding territories and influence while Charles, too ill to engage in diplomacy, relied on advisors whose decisions often favored foreign interests over national ones. The question of succession loomed larger than ever. With no heir to secure the Habsburg line and rival claimants French Bourbons and Austrian Habsburgs circling like vultures, Charles, aware of the stakes yet unable to act decisively, became a figurehead in a game of thrones that would determine the fate of Europe, his personal decline a microcosm of Spain's fading glory. Thus, Charles II languished in a prison of flesh and fear, his life a slow unraveling of pain and powerlessness. His deformities and supposed bewitchment, once mere curiosities, had become chains that bound him to a throne he could not truly command. As we move deeper into his story, we will witness the culmination of this tragic decline, a final chapter where the weight of a cursed crown would drag both king and kingdom into an abyss from which there could be no return. As the 17th century drew to a close, Charles II of Spain, the tragic figure known as El Hechizado, approached the end of a life defined by suffering and suspicion. Now in his late 30s, the king was a husk of a man, his body a twisted relic of the Habsburg dynasty's fatal obsession with blood purity. His once frail frame had grown even more emaciated, his skin sallow and stretched tight over bones that seemed ready to snap, while his iconic protruding jaw rendered his face a grotesque mask of pain with every labored word or bite of food. The court of Madrid, long accustomed to his ailments, now watched with bated breath as each day seemed to bring him closer to the grave, while the whispers of bewitchment reached a fever pitch, no longer mere speculation, but a desperate explanation for a reign that had become a slow, torturous death for both king and kingdom. This was the climax of Charles's story, a final, agonizing chapter where the weight of a cursed crown would crush him utterly, leaving behind a legacy of tragedy and uncertainty. By 1699, Charles's health had deteriorated to a point where even the most optimistic courtiers could no longer deny the inevitable. His seizures, a lifelong torment, grew more frequent and violent, often leaving him unconscious for days, his body convulsing as if possessed by the very demons so many believed plagued him. His digestive system, already a source of constant misery, failed almost entirely, forcing him to subsist on broths and liquids that he could barely keep down. Swelling in his legs and abdomen, likely a sign of heart or kidney failure, made movement an excruciating ordeal, and he spent most of his time confined to his bed in the Alcazar, surrounded by physicians whose outdated remedies offered no relief, and priests whose prayers seemed to fall on deaf ears. One contemporary account describes the king's chambers as a place of suffocating gloom, the air thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of Latin chants, a tomb for a man not yet dead but already mourned. The obsession with bewitchment, which had haunted Charles since childhood, reached its zenith in these final years. In a desperate bid to save him, or perhaps to absolve themselves of blame, court officials and clergy intensified their efforts to break the supposed curse. Exorcisms became almost daily rituals, with holy relics pressed against Charles's trembling hands and sacred oils anointed on his forehead, while charlatans and so-called mystics were summoned to perform bizarre rites. One particularly harrowing incident involved a supposed witch being dragged before the king, forced to confess to casting a spell on him decades earlier. Whether under torture or coercion, her words only deepened the paranoia that gripped the palace. Charles, too weak to protest and perhaps too broken to care, endured these spectacles, his eyes described by a witness as haunted by a quiet despair, fixed on some distant point beyond the room, as if already glimpsing the afterlife. Amidst this personal torment, the political crisis surrounding Charles's lack of an heir exploded into a full-blown catastrophe. His second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1690, like his first, had produced no children, his physical condition rendering him incapable of fathering a successor. The question of who would inherit the vast Spanish empire-spanning territories in Europe, the Americas, and beyond became the obsession of every major power. France, under Louis XIV, pushed for the Bourbon candidate, Philip of Anjou, while the Austrian Habsburgs, backed by the Holy Roman Empire, advocated for Archduke Charles. England and the Netherlands, fearing French dominance, wavered between neutrality and opposition to the Bourbon claim. Charles, aware of the stakes despite his frailty, was torn by indecision, his advisors pulling him in opposing directions, while foreign ambassadors whispered promises and threats. In his final months, the king's bedchamber became a battlefield of diplomacy, his dying body, a mere pawn in a game that would reshape Europe. The end came in the autumn of 1700, a slow and brutal unraveling that seared itself into the memory of all who witnessed it. On the 2nd of October, Charles suffered a particularly severe seizure, slipping into a coma from which he would only intermittently awaken. When conscious, he was delirious, muttering incoherently about salvation and curses, his hands clutching a crucifix as if it were his last tether to the world. His physicians, in a final act of desperation, subjected him to treatments so cruel they bordered on torture, blistering his skin with hot irons to draw out the poison and forcing noxious potions down his throat. These interventions did nothing but hasten his agony, his cries echoing through the palace halls, a sound that one courtier described as the lament of a soul already half departed. On the 1st of November, 1700, after weeks of unrelenting suffering, Charles II drew his last breath at the age of 38, his body finally succumbing to the myriad afflictions that had plagued him since birth. The room fell silent, save for the tolling of bells across Madrid, signaling the end of a regnant, unbeknownst to many, the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. The moment of Charles's death was not just a personal tragedy but a cinematic tableau of a kingdom on the brink. As news spread, the court was gripped by a mix of relief and dread, relief that the king's suffering had ended, dread for what lay ahead. Priests performed last rites, even as nobles scrambled to secure their positions in the uncertain future. Outside the palace, the people of Spain wept, not just for their king but for a nation they feared was cursed alongside him. Some whispered that the spell had finally claimed its victim, others that his death might lift the shadow over the land. But there was no time for mourning. The vultures of Europe were already descending, ready to carve up the empire Charles had struggled to hold together. His body, laid out in state, was a stark reminder of the price of dynasty, man so deformed, so broken, that history itself seemed to recoil from his memory. Thus, the climax of Charles II's life arrived in a crescendo of pain and powerlessness, his death a release from a prison of flesh and fear. Yet, even as his heart stilled, the consequences of his reign and the supposed curse that defined it were only beginning to unfold. As we turn to the aftermath, we will see how the bewitched king's passing ignited a firestorm that would consume Spain and reshape the world, leaving behind a legacy as haunting as the man himself. The death of Charles II of Spain, on the 1st of November, 1700, marked not just the end of a tragic life but the collapse of a dynasty that had shaped Europe for centuries. The Alcazar of Madrid, once a fortress of Habsburg power, became a somber stage for mourning and machination as the king's body lay in state, his deformed visage a final, haunting reminder of a lineage undone by its own excesses. The Spanish Habsburg line, which had ruled with iron and gold through the age of exploration and conquest, died with Charles, leaving behind a vacuum that would plunge Spain and the wider world into chaos. The whispers of bewitchment that had followed him in life lingered in death, coloring how his reign was remembered, while the immediate aftermath of his passing ignited a firestorm of political intrigue and war. This is the story of what happened after the bewitched king's heart stilled, a tale of a kingdom unraveled and a legacy cast in shadow. In the days following Charles's death, Spain was gripped by uncertainty, its court a cauldron of competing ambitions. The king's final act, a will signed under duress and clouded by his failing health, named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor. This decision, heavily influenced by pro-French advisors and the powerful Cardinal Portocarrero, was a bombshell that shattered the fragile balance of European power. The Austrian Habsburgs, who had hoped to see Archduke Charles ascend to the throne, cried foul, insisting that the will was the product of coercion or even supernatural manipulation, a lingering echo of the bewitchment narrative. England and the Netherlands, wary of French dominance, aligned with Austria, forming the Grand Alliance to oppose Philip's claim. Within weeks of Charles's burial, the stage was set for the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that would rage from 701 to 1714, drawing in nearly every major European power and costing countless lives. Spain, already weakened by decades of decline under Charles, became a battlefield, its people suffering under the weight of foreign armies and internal division. The war's impact on Spain was devastating, stripping away much of its remaining imperial glory. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the conflict, confirmed Philip V as king, but at a steep cost. Spain lost its European territories outside the Iberian Peninsula, including the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, to Austria and other powers, while Gibraltar and Minorca were ceded to Britain. The once mighty empire that Charles had inherited was reduced to a shadow of its former self, its economy in ruins and its influence diminished. For the Spanish people, the memory of Charles II became intertwined with this national humiliation, his physical deformities, and supposed curse seen as omens of the collapse that followed. Many blamed him, not for his own failings, but as a symbol of a dynasty that had doomed itself through inbreeding and hubris, a tragic figure whose reign marked the end of Spain's golden age. Beyond the political fallout, the personal aftermath for those closest to Charles was equally poignant. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, who had endured a loveless marriage and the constant pressure to produce an heir, was sidelined after his death, retreating to a life of obscurity in Toledo, where she lived until 1740, haunted by the memory of a court that had often scorned her. The nobles who had vied for power during Charles's reign faced uncertain futures under the new Bourbon monarchy, many losing influence as Philip V reshaped the court in a French image. The clergy, who had fueled the bewitchment hysteria, found their grip on power weakened as the Enlightenment began to challenge superstition, though the Catholic Church remained a dominant force in Spanish life. For the common folk, Charles's death brought no relief from their hardships. Famine, disease, and war continued to ravage the land, and the bewitched king faded into folklore, a cautionary tale of divine wrath or demonic interference whispered by firelight. The legacy of Charles II is a complex and often misunderstood one, shaped as much by myth as by history. In the immediate years after his death, he was vilified, his deformities and childlessness held up as proof of a cursed reign that had brought Spain to its knees. Chroniclers of the time, influenced by the prevailing superstition, often exaggerated accounts of his supposed bewitchment, describing exorcisms and dark rituals with lurid detail that bordered on fiction. Over time, however, as scientific understanding advanced, historians began to reframe his story through the lens of genetics, recognizing that his physical and mental afflictions were likely the result of severe inbreeding within the Habsburg family. Modern studies suggest he suffered from a combination of conditions, possibly including Klinefelter syndrome or hydrocephalus, compounded by the cumulative effects of a gene pool narrowed by generations of cousin marriages. This shift in perspective has recast Charles not as a victim of witchcraft, but as a tragic product of human folly, a man whose body bore the sins of his ancestors. Yet, even with this rational understanding, the aura of the bewitched king persists in popular imagination. In Spain and beyond, Charles II remains a figure of fascination, his life a Gothic tale of deformity and decline that captures the darker side of monarchy. His story has been told and retold in literature, art, and drama, often emphasizing the supernatural elements over the historical realities, a testament to the enduring power of myth over fact. Museums display portraits of him, his distorted features staring out across centuries, while scholars debate the extent of his agency in a reign marked by weakness. Was he merely a puppet of his advisors, or did he possess a quiet strength in enduring a life of such unrelenting pain? The question lingers, as does the shadow of a king whose very existence seemed to defy nature. Thus, the aftermath of Charles II's reign saw a kingdom unraveled, its empire fractured by war and its people burdened by the memory of a monarch marked by tragedy. His legacy, steeped in both historical fact and haunting legend, serves as a mirror to a Spain caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future. As we approach the final reflection on this bewitched king, we will ponder the deeper meaning of his story, a tale of human frailty, the perils of power, and the enduring mystery of a man who became a symbol of both curse and caution. In the annals of history, few figures evoke as much pity and fascination as Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a king whose life was a tapestry of torment woven from the threads of deformity, superstition, and dynastic decay. Known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched bore the weight of a crown that seemed to curse him from the moment of his birth in 1661 to his agonizing death in 1700. His body, twisted by the genetic sins of generations of inbreeding, became a canvas for the fears of a nation. His protruding jaw and frail frame, seen not as mere ailments, but as marks of dark enchantment in a Spain, gripped by religious fervor and decline. As we stand at the end of his tragic tale, having witnessed his suffering, the collapse of his empire, and the war that erupted from his childless death, we are left to ponder the deeper meaning of his story. What does the life of this bewitched king teach us about the fragility of power, the cruelty of fate, and the human capacity to endure against all odds? Charles II's reign, spanning nearly 4 decades, was less a rule and more a prolonged act of survival, a testament to a quiet resilience that history often overlooks in its rush to label him a failure. He was a man trapped in a body that betrayed him at every turn, unable to eat without pain, to speak without struggle, to father the heir his kingdom so desperately needed. Yet, amidst the seizures, the exorcisms, and the relentless political machinations of his court, there are glimpses of a soul that refused to break entirely. Accounts from his later years describe moments of tenderness, such as his gentle demeanor toward his wives, Marie-Louise of Orléans and Maria Anna of Neuburg. Despite the impossibility of their unions bearing fruit, they speak of his deep faith, his hours spent in prayer, seeking solace in a God he hoped had not forsaken him. In a world that saw him as a cursed relic, Charles clung to his humanity, a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness of his existence. Does this not challenge us to reconsider what strength truly means, not in conquest or command, but in the simple act of enduring when all seems lost? His story also lays bare the perils of unchecked power and the hubris of dynasty. The Habsburgs, in their obsession with blood purity, sowed the seeds of their own destruction, marrying within their ranks until their lineage became a genetic trap. Charles was the ultimate victim of this folly, his deformities likely a result of conditions like Klinefelter syndrome, or the cumulative effects of recessive genese, a physical manifestation of a family's arrogance. Spain paid the price alongside him, its golden age fading into economic ruin and territorial loss, culminating in the War of the Spanish Succession that fractured its empire after his death. The bewitched king became a scapegoat for these failures, his supposed curse a convenient explanation for a nation unwilling to confront its own missteps. Yet, how different are we today, when we seek simple answers to complex collapses, blaming individuals for systemic sins? Charles's reign forces us to question the cost of tradition, the danger of clinging to past glories at the expense of future survival. The shadow of superstition that defined Charles's life offers another lens for reflection. In a Spain where the Catholic Church wielded immense power and the Inquisition hunted for heretics, his deformities were not seen as medical tragedies, but as signs of divine wrath or demonic interference. Exorcisms, rituals, and accusations of witchcraft surrounded him, stripping him of agency and dignity, turning a suffering man into a spectacle of fear. This belief in bewitchment shaped not just his treatment but his legacy, embedding his story in a Gothic mythos that persists even now, centuries after science has explained his condition. It reminds us of the human tendency to fear what we cannot understand, to weave narratives of the supernatural when faced with the inexplicable. How often do we still fall into this trap, letting fear rather than reason guide our judgments, casting outcasts as cursed rather than seeking to heal or comprehend? As we close this chapter on Charles II, his life lingers as a haunting mirror to our own imperfections. He was a king who never truly ruled, a man whose body became his prison, a symbol of a Spain that stumbled from greatness into shadow. Yet, in his quiet endurance, in the tragedy of his isolation, there is a profound humanity that transcends the centuries. His story is not just one of decline, but of the struggle to find meaning amidst suffering, to bear a burden not of one's making with whatever grace can be mustered. Perhaps the true curse was not a spell cast by unseen forces, but the weight of expectation, the cruelty of circumstance, and the failure of those around him to see beyond his broken form to the soul within. What might have been different if compassion, rather than fear, had guided the hands that shaped his fate? For those who have journeyed with us through this tale of a bewitched king, let his memory provoke thought long after the screen fades to black. What lessons do we draw from a life so marked by pain and misunderstanding? How do we balance the weight of history with the need to forge a kinder future? I invite you to share your reflections, to ponder the enigma of Charles II in the comments below, or to pose questions that this story has stirred in your mind. History, after all, is not just a record of the past but a conversation with the present, and the bewitched king's voice, though slurred and faint, still echoes with truths we cannot ignore. Let us listen, and let us learn, lest we too fall under the spell of our own unexamined burdens.